The classical scherzo. In the classical era, the overall plan for a sonata or solo concerto consists of three movements, the first and last, or outer movements, in fast tempos, and the inner second movement in a slow tempo. The first movement would enact the drama of the sonata allegro form, and the last movement would be cast in the lighter, less demanding rondo form. In a symphony or string quartet, the overall plan would include another internal movement, which started life as a minuet and trio in a moderate tempo, and then gradually mutated into a scherzo in a moderate tempo, and then often a scherzo in a fast tempo. And there's really not a hard and fast line between the two. There are some movements by Haydn or Beethoven which are labeled as minuet and trio, but they're practically a scherzo. And many early scherzos are in exactly the same tempo as a normal minuet and trio. So at this point you may be saying, yes, Professor, but what is a minuet and trio? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's take it one term at a time. The minuet was a court dance in triple meter, that is to say, 3 beats to the measure, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, that originated in France in the 1600s. It's a dance of elegant simplicity, and it very quickly became one of the most popular dances for aristocrats at court or for professionals to perform on the stage. According to the English artist William Hogarth, the minuet is allowed by the dancing masters themselves to be the perfection of all dancing. I once heard an eminent dancing master say that the minuet had been the study of his whole life, and that he had been indefatigable in the pursuit of its beauties, yet at last he could only say with Socrates, he knew nothing. Sounds simple enough, yes? Well, there's a little more to it than that, because although the minuet appeared very simple, although it looked very straightforward and graceful, it was actually a very studied and highly affected simplicity. There was a prescribed series of steps, which was very long and very intricate. So even though it looked like something that might calmly be danced by simple folk, the simple folk wouldn't have time to learn such a pursuit. It was strictly a pastime for the idle rich. And this creates a problem with regard to music, because a typical piece of dance music wasn't long enough to accompany the entire sequence of prescribed steps. And it would be boring to keep repeating the same minuet over and over and over. So musicians would typically supply 2 pieces of music, a first minuet with each half repeated, and then a second minuet with each half repeated, and then typically going back and playing the first minuet one more time to tie everything together. Back in the 1600s, there was a composer named Jean-Baptiste Lully, who was a composer in the court of our friend Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. In his court ballets, Lully hit upon the innovation of adding contrast between the 2 minuets through the instrumental scoring. The first minuet would feature the entire orchestra. Then when the second minuet started, the strings would drop out, and the second minuet would be played only by the woodwinds, which in a French Baroque orchestra consisted of 2 oboes and 1 bassoon, a grand total of 3 instruments, and hence the name trio for the second minuet. So minuet and trio essentially means 2 minuets. This is not the case in all minuets and trios. For example, in a string quartet, there are no woodwinds, and the instrumentation of the orchestra evolved over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, but often composers would still invoke some sort of contrast. For example, in Beethoven's Symphony No. 1, the third movement is a minuet and trio, and at the start of the trio, sure enough, the strings drop out, so we hear only the winds. So again, the scherzo is a sort of mutant version of the minuet and trio, and in particular, it's a comical take on the form. Scherzo is the Italian word for joke. A piece marked as a scherzo would be written in the triple meter of a minuet and trio, but possibly with a faster tempo, generally with light articulation, lots of rhythmic surprises, off-balance syncopations, asymmetric phrase structures, odd harmonic detours. So lots of strange little deviations from a normal placid, calm dance form, but all played for laughs, not for high drama. In the 17th century, the form of each minuet would have been the simple binary form that you learned previously. Over the course of the 18th century, composers increasingly favored a modification of this form called the rounded binary form. It's almost identical to the template you learned earlier. The only difference is that in the second half, the initial A material recurs at the end, not in its entirety, but just in a brief form, enough to recall the opening and bring the form around to its beginning. So in any minuet and trio or scherzo by Haydn or Mozart or Beethoven, this is the formal template for the minuet and the formal template for the trio. So together they make up something that's called a compound ternary form, where the word compound means there are forms within forms. That is to say, there are three parts, a first, a second, and then a return of the first, and then each of those parts is itself a complete binary form. In performance, the first time through the minuet, each half is repeated, and going through the trio, each half is repeated. And then when we come back to the minuet, it's played without any repeats.